Hey everyone, this is Ryan Robinson here. If you haven't seen me on before, I'm one of the guys who does a lot of the work behind the scenes with the podcast, and just wanted to jump on before some of these podcasts coming up to ask if you would be willing to give us some feedback about what is and what is not working with the podcast so far. So we've set up a survey on the website, and if you have a couple minutes before or after this podcast, just jump over to mennonerds.com/podcasts/survey and you'll be able to fill it out there, and that'll help us figure out what we can keep doing from here on. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to our Mennonites webcast. My name is Caitlin Hansen, coming to you from Church for All People, and glad to have this conversation with Rachel today. Rachel is a sacred sexuality and empowerment specialist who graduated with an MA in religion from Claremont School of Theology, focusing on embodied spirituality and sexual ethics. She wrote a thesis titled Undressing Purity Culture: Finding Sexual and Spiritual Healing Through Neuroscience, Trauma, Recovery, and Embodied Interspirituality, focused on holistic healing for those marginalized or spiritually traumatized by the Christian church through LGBTQ identification and/or sexual suppression or abuse. Welcome, Rachel. Really glad to have this conversation with you for a number of reasons. I think it's a very relevant topic, and interested in what you have to say. And so would you just maybe take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me and wanting to have this conversation, because I definitely agree it is a super important conversation to have, and one that doesn't really happen very often. And so I grew up Mennonite. I grew up in Iowa, went to Iowa Mennonite school for some of my high school years, went to Goshen College, definitely was in the Mennonite bubble for quite some time. And then kind of branched away, began doing my own things. I began a blog called Our Stories Untold, which documented sexualized violence in the Mennonite church. And I particularly began it around my own experience with sexual violence at the time, the only memory I had was as a 3-year-old. Later, I realized my first relationship had also been abusive when I was 15 years old. I just hadn't categorized that as that, because I had a lot of blame towards myself for being a sexually curious person. And so all of my life until I was maybe 25, like 5 years ago, I realized, like, wait, that was also abusive. So I've been on this like sort of sexual healing journey, especially in the context of church and religion, and what does this mean? I've also been on a spiritual journey of very much finding my own, my spirituality, how I relate to God, to divine, to the oneness of this universe, and really, really understanding that and recognizing that my sexuality was very much integrated into my spiritual journey, but that it was also highly blocked because of that. And I started recognizing that actually my spirituality therefore was blocked as well, because I couldn't have this full sexual expression. So I became really curious about this and really kind of unintentionally started studying it. It was like, I mean, I feel like it was divinely orchestrated, but at the time it wasn't like I necessarily went to graduate school looking to study this, but I ended up in graduate school, not 100% sure why, but knew I was supposed to be there. Absolutely. And as I was there, it began evolving and revealing itself to me how this wanted to be birthed out of me, like this project wanted to be birthed out of me. And so, yes, I wrote this thesis. It was called Undressing Purity Culture: Finding Sexual and Spiritual Healing Through Neuroscience, Trauma, Recovery, and Embodied Interspirituality. And what I really began recognizing was how much our sexuality is related to our spirituality, how much it affects our spirituality, and how much purity culture and the shaming, the blaming, the secrecy, the just unwillingness to talk about our sexuality, how deeply this affects people on a very, very personal level, and how so many of us are carrying our own trauma and our collective trauma around this so unconsciously. Because most people, when they hear the word trauma, they think of violence, or they think of like a physical act that has been done to one person, and they don't necessarily categorize something that is collective or something that's being taught on a collective level as something that could be traumatizing. But what I began realizing through conversations and then through doing deep research is how this shaming and this unwillingness to have these conversations about sexuality was actually creating symptoms of trauma in people's bodies that were manifesting just in these major sexual blockages, or maybe not even sexual blockages, maybe sexual, I hate the word promiscuity because I think it in itself is a shaming word, but you know, in like the way that people express themselves sexually in the world, just that it was like an unintegrated form of sexual expression, and people feeling blocked and frustrated and unable to do anything about it and confused. Why am I like this? Why do I have this? And not knowing where to go, not being able to talk about it, feeling just more shame and fear around even having it. So that's sort of, I mean, I guess that's a very minor version of the story. You know, there's a lot more layers there, but that about assesses it up.
Yeah, and I'd like to get into some of those layers with you if we can. Maybe though we can start just by kind of giving a baseline definition of terms in case our audience isn't familiar. What do you mean when you say purity culture? What does that mean to you, and what are some of the implications that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, purity culture is something that began, or was like really became widely known in the 90s. And it became really popularized by the evangelical, more conservative Christian church. People like Joshua Harris wrote books called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. There's some other books that were really written during that era. Like I grew up on that book. I remember reading it at some point in high school. And it's really around the belief that you need to abstain from sex in order to have a viable spiritual life with God and with your mate one day. That, like, you know, is nothing new. Like, I think a lot of Christians believe that to some extent. Certainly not all, but that is sort of like a Christian belief. But purity culture almost upped it to a level where it was like, if you don't do that, then you are damaged goods. Like you aren't really redeemable in God's eyes. It was almost like you committed the cardinal sin, and like, sure, maybe you could like have an okay marriage or an okay sex life eventually, but like you've done something that has created something that will damage you basically for the rest of your life. It was like the severity of what would happen to you if you perhaps would engage in sexual activity outside of marriage. It also placed a lot of the responsibility on women. It very much made women be responsible for everyone's sexuality. So for example, if a man felt lustful, or if he, you know, made sexual advances towards a woman, it was often, well, what was she wearing? What did she say? How did she lead him on? Is she sexually promiscuous? You know, like all of these categories. And it wasn't so much focused on male behavior. Male behavior was very much talked in the context of like, you're going to be lustful. You're going to want to desire this. You know, don't do it. But like, if you do it, if you fall, it's because you've been tempted by the woman. And that belief was very much associated. I mean, it's an ancient belief really, where women are very much like associated with the devil, you know, Eve tempted with an apple. Like, it's like very much this, women somehow have this like satanic like relationship with their sexuality. That might sound extreme, but that's sort of like the undergirding belief system in it. And also the flip side of that is this belief that women just weren't lustful, or they don't have sexual desire. Like this belief that it's men who have this strong sexual desire, when in reality, women actually have an amazing sexual capacity. Women are capable of having so many more orgasms than men, having so many more different feelings inside their body. But most women have no idea that they're even capable of that. They have they really have sort of limited their relationship with their sexuality, cut it off. Like it's like that sexuality has become a shadow aspect of a lot of women because they're told and basically raised under this guise or under this belief that they don't have a strong sexual appetite, that like that's not expected of them. That's not a part of who they are. That's not a part of their biological makeup, which is all false. It's scientifically false. It's just not true. And so that's sort of some of the premises of purity. There were things like purity balls where dads would go, have like a purity dance with their daughter, give them a purity ring where they pledged to be celibate. And, again, that's like, it wasn't so much for the men. It was very much about the female sexuality, the female pledging to be celibate. Yeah, I mean, there's many layers into that too, but I think that's a pretty broad definition that I just offered.
Yeah, and so all of that resonates a whole bunch with, when I grew up and the messages that I was receiving during those years. To what extent is this purity culture that you're identifying, to what extent is it coming out of a legacy of really hundreds of years of social construction? And to what extent is it a new phenomenon that you're identifying? How do those interplay with each other?
Absolutely. Well, yes, everything I think is built on past experiences, even like within the collective consciousness that we're not even aware of. I've actually been doing a lot of reading around witch burnings and how so much of that I see relates to the modern day sexualized violence, like the Me Too movement that's happening, like how the witch burnings, like that's so in our collective consciousness, and yet it's something we're like barely even aware of. I certainly didn't think about it on a daily basis, but how that does affect the way that structures are made, the way that it's carried on, especially unhealed trauma. So there's a lot of it that is rooted in just biblical understandings. You can even look at like scriptures of Paul and the way that they've been interpreted, and the way that people believe that they need to care for their bodies. And there is modern day phenomena in the fact that when the purity culture movement began in the 90s, it started becoming very implemented in the public system. So, for example, schools, sexual health and sex ed was funded by abstinence-only programs that were church-based. And therefore, most people were fed some sort of version of purity culture, whether they went to church or not, whether they were Christian or not. It became sort of like the norm, was this abstinence-based education. So, and there were other ways in which this became just a part of our political systems, and I'm talking the United States, obviously, how it became a part of our political systems, how it became a part of just a lot of discussions as a whole. So even if people didn't really subscribe to purity culture, or they didn't grow up in that kind of culture, it was still there. Like, it is still very much implemented around. And I think the modern aspect of it was just how it took on, trying to find the wording, it just took on a more like structured, like it like kind of like forced itself in, and it was trying to counteract the fact that of teen pregnancies is really like that's kind of what started bubbling up, all these teen pregnancies, and then this kind of came in. And I think there's a lot of things. I mean, that could be a whole other sociological study, why were teen pregnancies bubbling up? Like, why was this happening? But it was sort of a response to the culture of the time and what was happening in the moment.
Yeah, so I know, at least in my own life, having grown up in this sort of purity culture, and having waited and all these things, then in marriage started seeing some of the consequences of that, to some of what you've articulated, feeling shut down, blame for one's own curiosity and all this stuff. What sort of consequences have you seen with others that you've interacted with and talked to?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a huge part of this. So I really took the direction of neuroscience when I was writing my thesis and when I was studying this, because I'm fascinated by the body-mind connection, that our bodies react to our thoughts and to our belief systems. And so when we grow up with a really concrete belief system like purity culture, and we really believe it and we buy into it, and it's a part of our life, we form these belief systems in our head, and maybe, you know, on the surface, those belief systems are like, oh, I'm not going to have sex until I'm married because I want to really, you know, honor myself and honor the person that I'm going to marry, et cetera, et cetera. But also there's those undergirding layers that aren't so conscious, like it's shameful to have sex, or I shouldn't be experiencing pleasure, or I shouldn't have lust, I shouldn't have desire. Or there's also this whole other component of it, of just like people aren't being taught of how to experience their sexual desire, like how to experience their sexual pleasure. Like I had no idea how to experience my sexual pleasure. I didn't know the anatomy of my entire vagina and vulva. Like I had no idea that I was capable of 7 different orgasmic expressions. Like, you know, I had no idea any of these things. And certainly the men or women that I was sexual with, they didn't know either. And so it becomes, so we start living by these belief systems. So then if someone gets married, or they've, you know, abstained to this belief system, and they're put in a sexual situation, well, those belief systems don't just go away. And yet we're expected to suddenly have this like awesome sex life, because that's kind of what we've been promised, you know. We've been told like, oh, you're going to have this great sex life. And so the body starts responding to whatever your belief systems are, which is where women start experiencing numbness, or just like they don't feel anything at all. You know, just like I've talked to so many women who are like, I just don't feel anything. Like sex sucks. Like I don't understand what the whole like rigmarole is all about. Or they might be experiencing pain, you know, like vulvodynia. There's a lot of different symptoms that women have of like pain in their pelvis. And that again is related to these belief systems that are being carried, being perpetuated through the body. The body is basically saying like, oh, this is dangerous. Like even if it's in this container of like safety and maybe a heterosexual marriage, you know, a husband, a wife situation, the body itself has been told for so long that that's dangerous, that once it gets into that situation, it responds in that way of feeling like it's dangerous. And so what I saw was just all these people who were talking to me. You know, some people would say, I feel like I experienced sexual abuse, but I don't think I ever have. I don't understand why I react this way. And then after talking to them for weeks and weeks and weeks, starting to hear like just things that happened to them as children, like having a surgery done on their vagina when they're 3 and not being told why or how or what needed to happen. And it's like, well, of course your body's responding to that as sexual abuse. Or like a woman, you know, who had sex outside of marriage. Maybe it was even in the context of an abusive high school relationship, and now feeling so shut down in her relationship with her husband, and just like, I just don't even want to have sex. The only reason I do it is for him. And that makes me resent him. And that makes me upset, you know? And so all these problems, which is like the opposite of what I think God actually wants us to experience, you know? Like we're supposed to be these, like our sexuality is one of the most powerful expressions we have as human beings. So it's very heartbreaking to me that this is what has been produced from these belief systems that we've carried around, that are meant to protect us, but in an actuality create much more disconnection from ourselves and from other human beings.
And so what is your advice to people that have experienced that? They're wrestling with this wide range of consequences to what they've been taught and believed for all these years. How does one move forward from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the first thing I always want people to know is that it is possible to move forward. I think so many people just accept where they're at sexually. I know I did. I remember being in college and even saying to my friends, like, oh, I just have a low libido. Like, I just don't desire sex. And that's totally not true. Like if I had thought back to being, you know, a 14-year-old, I had a off the charts libido. Like I was totally, you know, a sexually thriving human being, but I just hadn't experienced the shaming around my sexuality that I did in later years of my teenage years. So I think the first thing is recognizing where you're holding on to stories about your sexuality that might not actually be true. That's not to say that you don't experience that. Like, yes, you might not experience sexual desire, but that might not be because you just have a low libido. It might be because of these experiences you had. So I think facing the shadow side of one's sexual life and one's sexual story is extremely important. I always recommend people just even cognitively like thinking it through, writing it down, like writing down all the belief systems that you grew up with around your sexuality, and then looking through them and deciding like, is this my belief system or is this something else that I've inherited? Like, what is actually true for me? And really trying to tap into that. Like, what is my truth? Really understanding what a desire is. So, like making a proclamation of like, well, I want to experience, awesome sex with my husband. Like, I want to be able to experience pleasure with my husband. I want to find that to be this like joyous union where like we are one with the divine, and like that God is in our life through our sexuality. And so really cognitively working it out is definitely a first step. And then the next step is really learning your sexuality on an embodied level. So one thing that's very important that I say to all people is you have to start to introduce yourself to your own body. Like, we can't expect other people to satisfy us sexually if we have no freaking clue how to touch our own selves. And so that's really scary for a lot of people to go on that journey and to actually consciously masturbate. I prefer the word self-pleasure because I think that's really what it is. But actually getting to know your body, like studying your body. What is your body like? How does your body respond to touch? And allowing yourself to also experience the sadness within that. So it's not just about what you experience as pleasure. It's also about this path of purification, like touching yourself and actually feeling the grief inside your heart, feeling the sadness that you have, that you've been so disconnected from your body, really allowing yourself to express that. And then there's a lot of different somatic exercises that people can do to really heal their sexuality. It depends on what the particulars are that someone's working with. So I work one-on-one with people, and that's very much what we do in our sessions. I mean, we really understand what are the underlying issues keeping you from what you desire, from what you want in your sexual life. And then how can we implement different practices, different somatic exercises to actually help you develop what it is, create what it is that you desire in your life. So you can have awesome sex with your husband, or you can feel comfortable in your body. You can look at yourself in the mirror and be like, hey, I like that. Just the simplest things. Like, how can we create that in your life?
That's great. And so, as folks are kind of uncovering what their sexuality means to them, and what kind of undoing some of the lessons that they've learned, what guides do you suggest in that journey? Scripture for a lot of people has been really problematic. And, when the church has provided some really damaging narratives, it's hard to trust what the church has to say going forward. And so what are the guides as folks begin to explore that?
Yeah, well, I recommend that people read the book that I put out. It's for free, and so you don't have to even pay a penny. So it's a very easy guide for you, and it has a lot of exercises and that sort of thing that people can do. It isn't so much based in scripture, though. I will fully own that. I don't feel like I am. I find theology fascinating. I'm not much of a theologian. And for me, my strongest guide is my intuition and my relationship with God. Like, I chit chat with God about this all the time. And, people can say, oh, well, that's just you creating whatever it is. But like, I feel like it's me honoring my truth and honoring what is coming through me, and that for me, and I recognize this is totally personable and some people would probably disagree with that, but for me, that's the most important guidepost in my entire life, is like that relationship and what is in integrity with who I am and my divine purpose on this planet. But I also, there's some good books out there. Tina Marie Sellers is a Christian psychotherapist in Seattle, who she doesn't come from the embodied somatic direction so much as I do, but she is very much based also in this notion of purity culture and how it damages people's psyches. And she takes more of the strictly like their like cognitive talk therapy approach to it, but she has a lot of stuff on scripture and that sort of thing, and reinterpreting scripture. And so people who are interested in that direction, she's someone I would highly recommend. Also, there's a book called Damaged Goods. Gosh, what is her name? It was like on the tip of my tongue just a second ago. I don't know. Maybe I'll look it up really quick. But she is also really, really great. I used her actually in the book she has written, and she has some she has some scripture stuff in there. She also really reinterprets some aspects of the Bible and that sort of thing. It's called Damaged Goods: New Perspectives on Christian Purity by Diana Anderson.
Yeah, that's great, and so important, because I think the church really has lost a lot of credibility on this topic, and may still have really important things to say, may still have insight and perspective for us, but because of the damaging narratives that the church has brought to this point, it's hard to hear whatever aspects might still be useful in that. And so let's turn to your book a little bit more. It's called Sacred, Sexy, and Whole: Undressing Purity Culture and Redressing Redemption. Our audience can find it at rachelhalder.com/ebook. Or if you just go to her homepage, you can navigate there pretty easily. And so why don't you preview for our audience what they find in there?
Yeah. So this book was birthed out of my thesis. So it has a lot of the content of my thesis, not all of it, because some of it was, it's a thesis. It was a little dry. But a lot of it is content from my thesis, but made in a much more written personably, like written directly to you, written to the audience, and includes practices, like I said, that people can do to actually start healing their sexuality if that's the direction they want to go. The first part of the book really kind of talks about what we talked about at the beginning, sort of the historical background of purity, of sexuality, of women's bodies, especially moving into modern day purity culture, and really what that movement is about, and how it has created the shame inside of people's bodies, and how that neurologically affects people in their everyday life. And I don't just mean it affects their sex life. It really affects every aspect of a person's life. Like when I work one-on-one with people and their sexuality, it is incredible for me to see and to witness them start picking up on this, how their sexuality affects the way they are in the workplace, the way that they make money, the way that they approach the relationships with their family. It's like everything. It's not like, it's so funny because I think we really box sexuality like into this little corner, when really it's actually such an important aspect of our whole lives, and it affects our whole lives. And when that part of ourselves is out of balance, all of us is out of balance. It's like an ecosystem. Like our bodies are an ecosystem. And if one aspect of our ecosystem is really out of balance, well, then the other parts of our ecosystem are also going to be affected by that. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but not completely, because that's really what this book is about. It's about recognizing that ecosystem and understanding where the blocks exist in the ecosystem of our bodies, and how to really create a new ecosystem, a really sustainable ecosystem, an integrated ecosystem where we can feel alive in our sexuality that's in concordance with our belief system, that doesn't necessarily disregard our belief systems, but that works within the belief system itself. And so it's about 90 pages, I think. And just it has multiple chapters, and it just really breaks it down in what I believe to be a very readable, very like easy to understand kind of way, while still also taking you pretty advanced, like on a deep journey. I mean, I've had a lot of people be like, that book blew my mind. Like I feel like I'm a whole different person after reading that book. So it goes really deep. It's short, but very salient. And very much, here you go. Here's all I got.
I'd love to hear some more about some of the responses you've received, either to the book itself or just in conversations that you've had with folks. What has it meant to them on their journeys, and how have they experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, I have had a lot of people just really feel deeply appreciative to have their experience named. So many people, I think, have felt this, but they have had no kind of vocabulary whatsoever to talk about it. And they maybe haven't even consciously acknowledged it. It's just been this like thing kind of in the back of their minds or the back of their bodies that then once there's words put to it, it's like this mind explosion. It's just like this, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize like this is all happening. And so it was really, I've been in a training with 150 other women for the past 18 months from the Tantric Institute of Integrated Sexuality, where I've learned a lot of the healing modalities that I use in my one-on-one work. And it was amazing for me to have those women's reflections for the book, because I kind of thought, they've been in this program, they've been doing this deep dive in their sexuality, like surely none of this content will be new to them. And yet there were multiple women who had grown up in evangelical Christian settings and who, also have sort of broken out of that. Obviously, they're doing these programs and they read the book and they were just like blown away. They were like, I did not realize how so many of my sexual blocks are actually rooted in this. Like I thought they were other things. I didn't even consciously recognize that this was actually from my Christian history, like from my Christian background. Like I didn't even understand how this was playing into my life and into my experiences, and how they had these advancements in their own sexual healing by reading this book, even though they've been in this like super deep dive, like the most intense deep dive program you can be in for sexuality and healing. So that was really profound. And then from other people, I just had people really reflect on naming trauma in their lives. Like, wow, I never would have even said I had trauma in my life, but reading your book, I actually can recognize where I have experienced trauma and where it has affected me. And now I have hope for healing. Or people who even read it. Like I've had men who have read it. It's mostly written for women and LGBTQ persons, but I've had some men read it and have had them reflect like, wow, this is so important. Like, I think every man needs to read this just to understand, on deeper levels. And I think this does affect men on other planes as well. I don't think it's just this like gendered thing. Like women have unique aspects within this whole thing, but purity culture also affects men and their belief systems too, and their sexualities as well.
Yeah, that's an important note that, you're right. You may be gearing to, a particular audience, but really everyone can be informed and educate themselves in a way that's beneficial. And it kind of speaks a little bit to, your definition of trauma, which I really appreciate. It's not necessarily an event, a one-time occurrence, but a product of culture as well. And, we as a church kind of have a legacy of understanding things like, generational sin or corporate sin, things that get passed down generation after generation, or how an entire culture can be problematic and have consequences both on a group and individual level. And so framing trauma in that way, I think, is really important. I would love to hear more about some of your thoughts around the trauma that results from some of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's the collective trauma of just the collective consciousness of living in this world and the experiences that so many people have experienced, like have had with their sexuality. But there's also like the trauma that's passed down in lineages and families. And so if a grandmother, say, experienced rape, and she never dealt with that because there was no kind of space where she could talk about that. Like maybe it was her father, it was incest. And I know this happens in Mennonite communities, like absolutely. Like, so say that happens and the woman never ever talked about that. That doesn't mean it just disappeared. Like she lived with that. The way she acted in the world was very much based on that. And since this rape, this very traumatic experience that happened to her is in her consciousness, she passes that down onto her daughter that she births into the world. It can even be passed on. They've found in science that it can even be passed on in DNA. Unresolved trauma can actually like be within someone else's DNA. So then that woman goes around living, the mother goes around living very ashamed of her sexuality, very like fearful of men, maybe has troubles having relationships. I mean, I'm just making up this scenario, but this is a pretty likely scenario. And she doesn't understand why. She's like, this is kind of weird. I don't get it. But, the church just keeps confirming to her that her sexuality is shameful, that she shouldn't talk about it, that it's a secret. She can't even call her vagina a vagina. It's like a cuckoo or, some little flimsy word because it's like, oh, you shouldn't even name that part of you, you know? So she goes living through that. She has a daughter. That daughter has that experience, feels lots of shame, doesn't know how to. So it's like it just keeps getting passed down. And so whether these people have experienced trauma or not, they still are living within the like trauma field. Like it's still in the vibe of the family. Like, and maybe those languagings aren't right, but it's still present. Like, it's not like these things just disappear. It's the same thing with emotional trauma or with physical trauma. It's like, until it's resolved, until it's actually brought to consciousness, to light, to like understanding, until people can talk about it, it's there. Like, it doesn't just disappear. It just gets shoved into these dark corners. And so a lot of what has happened in the church, I think, you know, sexual violence especially has been totally shoved under the pew, but also just sexual pleasure. Like, I never grew up hearing sex was pleasurable, ever. I don't think anyone told me that sex was pleasurable. I had no idea if my parents were having pleasurable sex. For all I knew, they were never having sex. Like, I literally knew nothing like about it. And so, like, of course that affects me and my understandings of sex. And then if I hadn't dealt with it or haven't, you know, researched this and talked about it, then that would have affected any children that I bring into the world. And so it's like, it just keeps getting perpetuated until it's not, until someone says like, hey, no, we got to do something about this. You know, we have to talk about this. We have to bring it into consciousness.
Yeah, really important work that you're doing. You've mentioned the Mennonite Church in particular a couple of times. How has the response been in Mennonite circles? How has your work been received, particularly in that context?
It hasn't. This is actually the first Mennonite thing I've done. I honestly broke away from the Mennonite Church. Like, when I left my blog, Our Stories Untold, that was a very clear, actually, for me, like a divine download, that what I understood in the message that I received was that I had other work to do and I couldn't do it in that context. That like I had to sort of break some ties and step away so I could actually do what I needed to do. And I recognized in that I was so concerned about what Mennonites thought about me. I was so concerned about fitting in. I was so concerned about belonging. Like, you know, we all want to, like, that collective identity, and especially growing up cradle Mennonite, like that, you know, Mennonite high school, Mennonite college, like that was so in my being that in order to be able to have this conversation right now, I actually had to step away and say, you know what, I can't care what this church thinks about me. I can't really care how much they're going to hate what I have to say, what I have to research. And honestly, making that distance is what provided me the opportunity to do this research and to actually go into these depths and to understand this. And so I will admit I have been very shy of bringing it to the Mennonite world. I haven't known how to do it. I have a perception that might be false, that they're uninterested and don't want to know about it. And I have fear. Like, I do have like still fear of rejection or of not being received, you know, and fear of what might be projected back at me for talking about it. So truth be told, I really haven't even offered it to the Mennonite world. This is the first Mennonite anything that I've done.
Rachel, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's a really important perspective, and one that I think is not isolated. In fact, I would posit that it represents many others that wrestle with this and maybe have chosen to deal with it in a variety of ways, but then haven't necessarily been able to work through it in the context of the church. And I'm sure it causes folks to withdraw in one capacity or another, which is actually the opposite of what would be good for the church, you know.
Right.
But the burden shouldn't be on you know, individuals to stick it out and you know, be martyrs sacrificially themselves, you know, for the sake of the salvation of the corporate church. The impetus really needs to be on the church to be that place where these topics can be discussed. If not us, then who? And yeah, shame on the church if folks are having to leave to deal with some of the most integral and important topics of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that reflection. Yeah.
You also, talk about neuroscience. And so I'm curious, you've touched on it a little bit, but what does neuroscience have to say about our sexuality and our sexual journeys?
Yeah, well, there isn't a lot of explicit information that goes there. A lot of what I did was I researched a lot, especially around like meditation and neuroscience, like why meditation is such a powerful practice on the body, how it affects people, and also just forms of therapy that are much more embodied and why those work so much more powerfully than just like cognitive therapy, like talk therapy. And I applied a lot of that to the sexuality work that I was doing. But truth be told, I mean, a lot of the sexuality work is brand new, and it's not. It's ancient. Tantra in both the Hindu and Taoist tradition, ancient China, they've been doing this for millennial. But even in those societies, it went underground. It got pushed underground because it was so shameful. And so those were underground movements. They still weren't even, mainstream movements within the Hindu tradition or the Taoist tradition. And so a lot of this is new. Like, I feel like it's very much on the cutting edge. It's very much unexplored territory. And so really what I found was a lot of information about the body and the mind and how they work together. And I personally applied that to sexuality. So while I was reading all of that, for me, it was like these massive ahas exploding in my brain of why I was blocked sexually, of why I couldn't get over my hangups and all of these things. And I started then searching for answers, like, how can I get over it? Like, what is out there? And so I started finding these different modalities of healing and then applying what was happening to me by utilizing these modalities of healing under the lens of neuroscience. So if that makes sense, it was like no one explicitly wrote a book about it that I read. I just kind of piecemealed it all together for myself.
Sure. And isn't that what research is all about? Bringing those studies together and synthesizing into something new. So that's great. And so where do you see your work and your ministry, frankly, go from here? What's next for you and your work?
Yeah, so I work one-on-one with people, and I love groups. Like, group settings are really what bring me alive, where I really just feel so much energy. I feel so energized when I'm working in group settings. And really just what I see myself doing is helping people bridge their spirituality with their sexuality. And I don't just work with Christians. I mean, I do have, I have a couple clients who are still Christian. I also have clients who like grew up Christian, even grew up Mennonite, and feel like, oh, well, I don't even know what I really identify as anymore, but I do see that like these belief systems are still in my life. And then I work with people who are totally like unassociated to Christianity even, but still feel like they have these blocks in their life. But really I see my purpose and my ministry, I like that word. I see it really being helping people bridge their spirituality with their sexuality, really finding holiness in their orgasmic capacity, really finding their divine strength in their pleasure and not feeling shame around that, and being able to express themselves how they hope to express themselves in the world. So I definitely in no way, shape, or form tell people how they need to be. It's all about what they want to be and helping them get that and implement that in their life and in their space.
That's great. And that's just such a great redemptive vision for us as individuals, having come through, this cultural season of purity culture, and we're probably not through it. It's probably still being reinforced all the time. But that vision that you've set forth of freedom and life abundant, right? That God would have for us. That's just such a great vision. And so moving from individuals to the corporate church, what would be your vision for the church as a whole going forward?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see the church being receptive to this message. It was interesting. My one of my thesis advisors was like, you have to go to churches and talk about this. And I was like, no way. I was like, if churches invite me in, I will do it. But I am not going to try to force my way into talking to churches who aren't even receptive to the message, you know, like, not that they have to agree with me, but just even being receptive. Like I've done a lot of forced reception, and it has resulted only in my pain, you know? And so I definitely would love the church to be open to even having these conversations. I mean, it's so amazing to me just to even watch people in my life who are in the church and even talking about this, how uncomfortable they get, like the shame that's just like so obvious, where they're just like, most people just go silent. They're just like, oh, like deer caught in the headlights. But it's like, even that, like even just opening up spaces where sex could be talked about, like, wow, how powerful would that be? And just to really, I mean, my heart goes out to kids these days, because they're getting this information, they're getting it online, they're watching porn. I mean, it's not like they're not knowing what sex is. I think they know better than I knew what sex is, and certainly better than probably what my parents knew when they were in their early teens. But where they're getting this information from is not, I don't think it's healthy. And it makes me so sad that that's the lens that they view sexuality through. And it's certainly not a spiritual lens. It's certainly not in connection with their relationship to God. It's certainly, and it's not coming from their loved ones. It's not coming from their community. It's not coming from their parents, you know. It's this like isolated thing, which just perpetuates this on. So also would just love to see children getting the proper sex education that they need, not just the don't do it education, you know, but like the actual, like, this is your body, and like you should understand and know how your body works kind of education. Yeah.
So there you go. That's, you know, open to the church, extend the invitation, and engage in the conversation. If not the church, then who? But we step back and shirk from our responsibility, or misinterpret our responsibility, and end up causing a lot more damage than healing, which is, I would guess, not exactly what Jesus would have for us as a church.
Yeah.
And so, Rachel, I think this is all really helpful. Maybe as folks want to continue to engage in the conversation, can you tell folks, you know, how to find you? Where are you on social media? How can they continue to explore these ideas going forward?
Yeah, they can email me, rachel@rachelhalder.com. I also have the website, rachelhalder.com. It's still kind of in construction because I'm creating it myself, but the ebook is up there, and I'll have other things up there. I have group programs, especially for women, like starting mid-January. I'm doing a jade egg, which is a whole other topic that we didn't get into, but I'm doing like a group intensive for healing. So if people are interested in taking a plunge into their sexuality, and especially really interested in healing, that would be a great option. Also one-on-one sessions if people want that. Instagram is at The Sacred and the Sexy, facebook.com/thesacredandthesexy. Yeah, there's lots of different, flying that thing. There's lots of different avenues that people can go that they can, yeah. And I write about this stuff daily. So if you follow me on Instagram, I basically come out with different writings on a daily basis. So if people even just want to secretly follow along, they can do that pretty well.
Well, that's great, Rachel. Thanks so much for sharing with us and your time, and really your courage in being open and willing to share your testimony, share your witness, and one more time and engage the church in a topic that the church hasn't handled well. So thanks. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it and to move out of my own comfort zone too, and open myself up to maybe some more controversial conversations.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at mennonerds.com. It's the hub for all things Mennonerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out mennonerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.